All right, good morning. So we are up to the book of Shemuel Aleph, chapter 18, Perek Yud Het. We concluded 2 classes prior to this on the story of David and Goliath. And we noted that at the end of that story, David and Shaul's relationship continues to get more entangled. David remains in his house. And we're going to see this relationship continue to develop, deepen, and become more and more complicated and more challenging. In this book, we're on 683. That's in the Rabbi Sachs Hebrew English one, 683. And the other one, the Art Scroll one, what page are you on, Lisa? 690. So 683 or 690, you're in somewhere there. Chapter 18 is going to talk a lot about relationships, a lot about feelings and relationships between David and all of the different people in the story. So we're going to talk about David and Shaul. David and Shaul's son Yonatan is going to open the chapter. We're going to talk about David with the servants in the palace in Shaul and the rest of the Jewish people. And then also Shaul's daughters are going to come into play. By the end of this chapter, David will become Shaul's son-in-law, but how we get there is going to be an interesting winding road. So a lot of interesting things to tackle here. Why don't we get started? We'll read the opening Pesukim, and then as we go bit by bit, we'll analyze what's taking place. So chapter 18, Perek Yud Het opens, Vahi kechaloto ledaber el Shaul. And after the conversation, that very cryptic conversation, we ended chapter 17 off with, where Shaul pretends as if he doesn't know who David is, which we explained, according to the rabbis, is really him trying to figure out David's lineage and his legitimacy. After this is over, Shaul recognizes David's legitimacy. V'nefesh Yehonatan nikshera b'nefesh David. The soul of Yehonatan, Shaul's son, is tied, is bound together with the soul of David. Vayehavehu, and he comes to love David. Vayehavehu Yehonatan kenafsho. Yehonatan loves David as if it was his own soul. Shaul takes David on this day and does not allow David to return back to his father's home. Yonatan and David establish a covenant with each other through the love which they have for each other as soulmates. Yehonatan strips down from the coat that is on him. In other words, he takes off his outer tunic. And he gives it to David as a sign of their covenant with each other. And he takes and he gives them to David together with his sword, his bow, his belt. These are all of Yonatan's accoutrement, so to speak, his weaponry. And all of this is to forge this covenant between the two of them, one party giving to the other. David is sent out by Shaul for various tasks, and anything he sends him to do, David is successful. Shaul places him as the leading general of his army. And it is good in the eyes, David is good in the eyes of all of the nation, and also in the eyes of the servants of Shaul. So let's pause here. We just read the opening 5 Pesukim, and there's a lot that one can pull apart from these Pesukim. What stands out to you? I'll just open up the floor. What stands out to you about what we're seeing in the opening of this chapter? A lot of interesting things. Okay, so we see that symbol again of transferring clothes to make a covenant. We saw that in the previous chapter where Shaul took off his armor to give to David, right? And David couldn't handle it, right? We noted that the Midrash says that the clothing fit, but Shaul got very nervous by that. And so David took it off because we noted that this idea of giving the armor from one party to the other is like transferring ownership to the next person, right? The next person is going to take your spot, so to speak. But it's clearly a symbolic idea of the relationship between two parties. And so here we have Yonatan taking off his tunic, his armor, his weaponry, giving it to David as a show of their closeness with each other.
Is it a show of closeness, or is it a show of, I see that each of you is in a position next to
okay, this could also be as, if we're going with the parallelism here from the previous chapter, this can also be a sign of, just as Shaul was, unbeknownst to him at the time, coincidentally giving over the reins to David, Yonatan is doing the same. And that would be important because Yonatan is the son of Shaul, which means, rightfully so, he would be, all things being equal, the next in line to take over the throne. But we know that Shaul, because of his missteps, had the kingdom removed from him. So that Yonatan is basically giving over from himself to David to show, I kind of recognized you're going to be the next guy, taking a position that in the eyes of many should be filled by me, but I'm willing to give that over to you. So that would be another similar idea. Okay. Right, so Shemuel writing the book, going back to that symbol. Well, we've seen Shemuel use clothing as a symbol all throughout the book, right? Starting back all the way there. I mean, I wasn't even going to go that far back, but they're going like all far back to Hannah. Yeah, she makes him a me'il that he brings to Shemuel as the sign of Shemuel's significance. And then we saw Shemuel's coat was torn by Shaul as the sign of the kingdom being. So we can almost trace the destiny of these different characters and their importance and their significance through the clothing that they wear and the different happenings that happen through clothing.
Why else would they need a covenant? Like, they don't need a covenant.
Right. Why do they need to create a covenant? To show we're on the same page, knowing that you're going to take my spot. So I want to deepen that idea that Amy's bringing out a little bit more with the opening line of the chapter. The opening line of the chapter tells us that that Shaul's soul was bound up in Yonatan's soul was bound up in the soul of David. Where does that language remind us of? A soul being bound up with another soul, a nefesh, kashur. Does that language ring any bells? It was last week's parasha. We read it 2 days ago. Who else's soul was bound up with somebody? Close, Binyamin and Yaakov, right? At the beginning of Parashat Vayigash, when Yehuda approaches Yosef to tell he doesn't know it's Yosef at the time, but the monarch of Egypt, he tells him why we need to take Binyamin back, and I'm willing to sacrifice myself for the sake of the young boy, Binyamin, because why? V'nafsho keshura benafsho, because his soul is bound with his soul. Yaakov and Binyamin have a bond in their soul that is unlike anything else. They cannot live without each other. And so Yehuda is willing to step in and take the servitude which has been decreed upon Binyamin in order to save his brother because of the soul binding that is existing between Yaakov and Binyamin. And that, I believe, here is hinted to in our text as well. Because think about that story. What happens in that story? Yehuda is willing to sacrifice himself on behalf of his brother Binyamin. When did Binyamin ever repay that favor to Yehuda? Here. Because where does Yonatan descend from? Yonatan is a descendant of Shaul from the tribe of Binyamin. And where does David descend from? He descends from the tribe of Yehuda. What is happening in here? It's the reverse. Yonatan from the tribe of Binyamin, his soul is bound up with Yehuda and is making an entirely selfless act. He's saying, you Yehuda, you David who are from Yehuda, I'm willing to allow you to take my place. I'm willing to sacrifice myself on your behalf because I know you're the rightful spot, you're the rightful heir to the throne of my father. And even though my father will now give to you what he should have given to me, I'm okay with it. So that original act of kindness that Yehuda does for Binyamin to sacrifice himself for a soul being bound with a soul is now being repaid by Yonatan, willing to sacrifice for Yehuda, right? Yehuda who's from Binyamin, willing to sacrifice for David, who's from Yehuda, to take the rightful position of the throne. And that, I think, is what's being hinted to by that opening line. The Yenafsho Keshura Benafsho idea is supposed to bring the reader back to that story of Joseph and his brothers and what took place between the dynamics of these three tribes, in particular, Binyamin and Yehuda for each other. Additionally, what happens over here is, notice how the text waffles back and forth between Shaul and Yonatan. Yonatan has one relationship with David. Shaul has another relationship with David. David is passive. He's being discussed in this opening, but he's not doing anything. It's just how the other characters, Shaul and Yonatan, are relating to him. So Yonatan is bound up with his soul, wants to make a covenant. Shaul kind of holds on to David also, but why is he holding on to David? Look at the language in verse 2. He says, "Velon netano lashuv el beto." He didn't allow him to go back to his home. What does that invoke? Almost like David's a what? David's like a prisoner. Shaul is keeping him a hostage. He's holding him captive close to him. That's why I titled this class, "Keep Your Friends Close, Keep Your Enemies Closer," right? That's sort of where Shaul's coming from. So Yonatan is getting close to David because of his feelings of love, of ahava, which is clearly mentioned in the opening lines, the binding of their soul together, the love, the unconditional love that he has for him. Shaul is keeping David close because he's nervous about him, because he's scared of him, because he realizes the siyata dishmaya, the godly divine help that David has and how he's being successful with everything. So Shaul's keeping David in a very possessive, hostage, prisoner type way. And this juxtaposition, this contrast between the two of them, I think is what the narrator is doing by going with Yonatan and then Shaul, and then Yonatan and then Shaul. So you can notice Pasuk 1 talks about Yonatan's love. Pasuk 2 talks about holding on. Pasuk 3 talks about 3 and 4 talks about Yonatan and David making their covenant. Pasuk 5 talks about Shaul placing him as the head of the army. In other words, placing him as the head of the army is not a lovely act on the part of Shaul. It's a very nefarious type act, as we're going to see through the chapter. Shaul is hoping that something will come to harm to David, right? That's why he's placing him in those positions, and that will run deep throughout the chapter. But what's clear is everybody who comes in contact with David loves David, with the exception of Shaul. Even Shaul's servants, look at the last line of verse 5. Vayitav be'enei kol ha'am. All of the people are happy with what David is doing and how he's leading the war efforts and how he's successful in everything that he does. And even the servants of Shaul love him, right? Why is that so surprising? Well, they're supposed to be loyal to Shaul, an excellent point by Liz, but also generally speaking, here's Shaul bringing this David, this young guy who was never an officer, and all of a sudden he's climbing the ranks. What happens to all the other officers when they see somebody climbing the ranks very quickly? Jealousy ensues, they try to sabotage him, but everybody is just captivated by David. He has this quality, this charisma about him, and the success that Hashem is giving him. Nobody minds. They love David. They're happy to see David be successful, despite the fact that he's more successful than them, which is a rare thing to find. So the chapter so far is opening with this idea that everybody is in love with David, with the exception of Shaul, right? And that's going to continue to play itself out as we further our reading within this chapter.
Did Shaul love him before, when he was his heart player?
He did. Right, he did. We saw that Shaul was also very taken originally by David before he had this idea, that this notion that David was going to step into the limelight and be his successor. Right, he was very taken by David. He wanted David to stay, and he sent word to Yishai to stay, and he was very happy with David. And then all of a sudden, after the victory with Goliath, a shift occurs. This ruach ra'ah all of a sudden continues to come upon Shaul, and he becomes obsessed with harming David, and that's what we're going to see now. And it's going to further now as we read the next couple of Pisukim. So watch as this progresses. And now we're going to see really the first hatred that Shaul has for David. Look at verse 6 now. We continue to read through the chapter. When the troops came home after David had successfully destroyed and killed the Pelishti, so the story of Goliath still looms large. ותצאנה הנשים מכל ערי יהודה לשיר והמחולות לקראת שאול המלך. Right, all of the women come out, as is typical after a victory, like Miriam invokes the image of Miriam singing and dancing after the splitting of the sea. All of the young women come out from the cities of Israel to sing and to dance likrat Shaul HaMelech, at the arrival of Shaul the king. Betupim ubesimcha ubshalishim, with timbrels and shouting and sistrums and all different instruments, and there's joy, singing and dancing in the streets, because the Jews were successful against their nemesis, against the Pelishtim. Verse 7, v'ta'anena hanashim hamsahakot v'tomarna, the women who were, interesting language, misahakot. Misahakot sounds like playing around, fooling around almost a little bit, right? But misahakot also means laughing and joyousness. V'ta'anena, they called out v'tomarna, and they chanted, Hikash Shaul ba'alafav. Shaul smote thousands. V'David berivivotav, and David tens of thousands. This is a key line, one to remember that stands out. What does this mean? Pshat-wise, when you're reading it. Yeah, everyone's recognizing the greatness of David, and it sounds like they're promoting David in his greatness more so than Shaul. And that's certainly the way Shaul takes it. As we read the next pasuk, verse 8, Vayichar leShaul me'od. Shaul is very upset about this. He is distressed. Vayera be'enav hadavar hazeh. This is evil in his eyes. Vayomer, and he says, Natnu leDavid revavot. They gave to David tens of thousands. Veli natnu ha'alafim, and to me they gave thousands. Ve'od lo acha melucha. All that he lacks is the kingship. What's left for him to take from me, if not to become the king? So this incites Shaul. And as a result, in verse 9, Vahi Shaul oyen et David mehayom hahu v'hala. Shaul, from this day forward, is oyen et David. What does the word oyen mean? Anybody know what the etymology, like what's the root of that word? Ayin. What does ayin mean? To see. Like literally means he kept his eye on him. Shaul now is taking a closer look at David. He's oyen et David. His eye is on David. But for us, this invokes very uncomfortable feelings. Imagine you knew someone was oyen you. He was looking at you all the days of your life. What does that feel? It's ayin hara, right? This is like, I don't want anybody looking at me all the time. Like he's investigating, analyzing everything he does, every move he makes, every step he takes. That's the feeling we have that Shaul is doing towards David. It's not a positive thing, right? This is not, I'm keeping my eye on you to learn from you. This is, I'm keeping my eye on you because I know you're a troublemaker and I'm not letting you go, right? This is like when the teacher tells the student who's fooling around, I'm keeping my eye on you. It's not something that you want to have. This is a very negative connotation from Shaul towards David. He definitely has an evil eye towards David. So this is the way Shaul is getting it, and he's this reaction to the post-war and the way that people are looking at him is just inciting what appears to be jealousy, frustration, anger within Shaul, and these emotions are not positive ones. They're negative ones that are going to eat away and gnaw away at Shaul. A question that I'd like to present, though, is that really what the girls meant when they did that singing, right? Were they trying to incite Shaul with that phrase, Hika Shaul ba'alafav v'David b'rivotav? Were they in the wrong in some way? Were they being demeaning towards Shaul? Yes or no? Yeah. Right. So if they were truly saying what they were saying, right? Right. So that's why I highlighted that word misahakot. Misahakot could mean that they were doing so kind of like, not seriously, right? Sort of like in jests, kind of like, look, everyone's dancing, everyone's happy, everyone's singing. It's like, huh? Right. Right. They should be singing about the accomplishment, but the contrast to Shaul is what is clearly disrespectful, right? So if we say that the girls are being serious over here and what they're doing is very straightforward, you could say that Shaul has a reason to be upset. He definitely has reason to be angered. And he could look at this as a disrespect to the Melucha. People don't know David has been crowned as king. Shaul himself is not even positive about it. He has his suspicions. He knows he's not going to remain the king. His children are not going to inherit. But right now, at this point, everybody looks at Shaul as the king. And so this is a clear disrespect to the king, right? Now, what's so ironic about this is, think about Shaul's origins. Think about his beginning. What was his original reaction when people disrespected him? Remember that first time? Think all the way back, right? He was so humble, right? He was almost too humble. We criticized him back then for being too humble, right? Because, you have to stand up for yourself. When he was first anointed as king and people were like, this guy's going to lead him? Like, what's going on over here, right? Shaul said, no, I'm going to leave it alone. He ignored them. Even after he won the battle and people said, kill them, he said, I don't want to kill them, whatever it is. And now think about where we've gotten to, where we've evolved, to all of the different stories that have occurred, to the point where the girls speaking in jest on the street is inciting him to jealousy and violence and this and that. Like, look at how far we've come, right? To where real disrespect, Shaul didn't treat. He was humble enough to let it go, which was a good thing. Now we've deteriorated to the point where things that he should be ignoring, like, Shaul, would he care? Like, it's the girls talking in the street corner. Like, it's not important. And that this is causing him to become obsessed. Insecure, right, yeah.
Even forget that he lost Ruach Hashem.
Right.
He feels that it's free.
Yeah, so without that security, without that Ruach Hashem, I'm saying you can see the lesson being that when a person becomes obsessed with his standing in what it is, the smallest things can all of a sudden, but when a person is confident in who they are, then even real types of disrespect he doesn't care about. So that's where that self-confidence, that self-esteem is so important to how you react towards other people. Many commentaries say here that the words of the girls was not even a disrespect to Shaul. Many of them explain this is like, it's classic textual play. In other words, you have other psukim in the Torah that say, like for example, by the curses in Kitavo, it says that what's going to happen? You're going to chase 1,000, you're going to be chased by tens of thousands. In other words, that's just the literary way of the poetic way, so to speak, of speaking. It's not even to Shaul's discredit. It's just the poetic way in which they created this chant and song. It wasn't even something Shaul should have even been bothered by. It wasn't an affront to Shaul at all. But when a person, again, is obsessed with his standing, who is self-conscious, they'll take any little thing and twist it into, oh, that this person must be upset at me, right? I mean, think about a time when you don't have such a great relationship with somebody, or you're uncomfortable with yourself, and someone makes the smallest thing. And what do you mean by that? What are you saying? You implying something? And like, oh, I didn't say anything. Like, I wasn't how it was meant to be taken. But when you're jumpy about those things, we interpret anything that anybody says as being a slight to us, right? That's they call it projection, right? You're projecting your feelings onto what the other person is saying when that's not what the person meant at all. So I think what the text over here is illustrating to us is we can see how sensitive Shaul is to what's going on right now. The smallest thing is inciting him, despite where it's coming from, the fact that it's not even meant in that way. He should not take this as an affront whatsoever, but because of where he's at, he's being incited by even the smallest of things, and it's leading him down a very dark path.
Can we talk about something? What
Sure.
is he supposed to be doing in this interim period? He knows
What is Shaul supposed to be doing?
Yeah, like it's a really awkward time period.
Yeah, Shaul's in a tough spot.
Why even allow for this time period?
What should Shaul be doing? It's hard for me to say, but what he should be doing is putting his head down, leading the kingdom, preparing for what's going to be afterwards, and whoever comes up is going to come up. It's out of his hands now. That's really what he should be doing. But that's hard. It's hard to do. It's what we call it a lame duck, right? Right, when they say like in sports, when a coach knows he's going to be fired, but he's still going in, or you have a principal of a school who knows their contract is ending and they're not renewing it, and then like just the rest of the school year, they're just like kind of like they don't really not getting much life out of them because they know their term is over. Shaul's a lame duck right now. He's in that weird space, but I think what lame ducks usually need to do is they take pride in themselves. They do their job as they were supposed to do to the best of their ability, despite knowing they're not going to continue. And then we're, graciously bowing out when the other person is ready to take on. Now, is that a very hard thing to do? Yeah, that's a pretty tough thing to do because as human beings, we are about our kavod. We want our honor. We don't want to be shamed and embarrassed, but that is what it is. These are Shaul's mistakes led to this scenario. So yes, he is in a lame duck middle ground position, which is hard to navigate and makes him susceptible to this type of behavior. Yeah, Yonatan is right. Exactly. Yeah, that's the greatness of Yonatan's character for sure. No doubt. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a great point. An excellent point for sure. Let's continue reading through the chapter. We'll see how the relationship continues to complicate itself. We're up to verse 10. Vahimi machorat, the following day, vatitzlach ruach Elohim ra'a el Shaul. An evil spirit of God grips upon Shaul. Vayitnabe betoch habayit. The word vayitnabe is an interesting word. Vayitnabe literally means what? It comes from the word nevu'ah. It seems like he prophesies in the house. But that's a hard concept because he has the ruach ra'ah. Like, what prophecy is he receiving about ruach ra'ah? Many translated here, he raves in the house. He begins to become enraged, right? He starts to like lose himself a little bit. V'David minagen biyado kiyom beyom. David is playing the harp by him as day in and day out, as his job was, especially when these bouts of ruach ra'ah come upon Shaul. V'hachanit biyad Shaul. And the spear is in Shaul's hand. We already know what that means, right? We noted that in the previous chapter, how Shaul is always going to be described as having some kind of weapon by him at all times, in contrast to David, who didn't use a weapon to kill Goliath. So Shaul's going to try to use this spear now to kill David, and he's going to be unsuccessful. Verse 11, Vayatel Shaul et hanit. Shaul hurls the spear towards David. Vayomer, with his mind, thinking in his mind, or saying to himself, Akeh b'David ubakir. I will pin David up against the wall. That's what he wants to do. He wants to send a deep message and pin David and kill him up against the wall. Vayisov David mipanav pa'amayim. And twice this happens, David eludes him. Now, what happens here? Let's keep reading for a minute. Verse 12, Vayira Shaul milifnei David. Shaul becomes very scared of David. Ki haya Adonai imo, because he sees that God is with him, in that David eluded his spear twice, not coincidentally. Umeim Shaul sad, and he sees that God has removed himself from Shaul. Verse 13, Vaisirehu Shaul me'imo, so Shaul removed from him his presence. Vaisimehu lo sar elef, so Shaul makes a decision. He doesn't want David to be around him anymore. He sends David out. He's no longer going to have David as his harp player. Shaul removes David from his presence, Vaisimehu lo sar elef, and places him as a chief of 1,000. In other words, he gives him a military position. Vayetze vayavo lifnei ha'am. And David goes out and comes in from in front of the people. In other words, he leads his troops in and out whenever military needs are there, right? We know Shaul continued to fight many battles against neighboring nations all throughout his tenure till the day he died. So David is a major position now in his military. Before we continue, there's a little break here. So what just happened? Shaul attempts to kill David, and twice David dodges him. But what about from David's perspective? What does David make of this? So why doesn't David react?
It's an awkward situation. The whole thing is awkward.
The whole thing is awkward, but I think what's clear, we're going to see that something else is going to happen in the next chapter. Because in the next chapter, Shaul's going to attempt to kill David as well, and David's going to run away. Why didn't David run away? Why didn't he react? Why isn't he scared? The answer is because David doesn't know that he tried to kill him. Shaul throws the spear at him to kill him, and David haphazardly gets out of the way. But he doesn't realize that he was under attack, right? In other words, God is steering him, but like it's one of those scenes in the movie where like the guy tries to kill him and he ducks, but like he was picking something up from the ground. Like, at the very moment that Shaul did it, David like bent down and came back up. He doesn't even see what happens, right?
Oh, so that's why Shaul sees him.
Yeah, that's why Shaul sees that he's with David, because he notices David doesn't even realize he's trying to kill him, and David's getting out of the way of other things. Usually Shaul would say, it should be easy for me to kill him. David doesn't know I want to kill him. And now all of a sudden he's doing these two attacks. David happens to move out of the way, but David doesn't even realize. Shaul realizes it though. That's why Shaul gets very scared and he gets very nervous. And Shaul says, you know what? I just don't want him in front of me. But David continues to operate as if this scene, okay, Shaul wants me to do this, so I'm going to do this. He still thinks that there's a bond between them and Shaul. So one party over here is obsessed with anger and jealousy and rage, wants to kill the other, and the other one has no clue. That's what's happening over here. It's pretty amazing. But this is what brings Shaul to this epiphany, right? That David is serious business. He's a real threat to him. But Credit to Shaul, by the way, who catches a grip with himself and says, all right, I'm going to remove David from me, right? In other words, you still see Shaul's good side come about a little bit here in that he doesn't try again to kill David, right? He at least has the mindfulness to recognize something's happening here. Okay, I got to just remove my presence from David. Let David go do something else, and I'll just take care of my business. He's trying to help himself in some kind of way, but it's not gonna help him. He's gonna continue to have these bouts of ruach ra'ah. Let's go to verse 14. David was successful in all his undertakings, for God was with him. This is a pasuk that many people have accustomed to recite on the Havdalah of Motzei Shabbat. Almost invoking David's zichut that we should have a successful week. That just as David was successful because Hashem was with him, we too should be successful in our week because Hashem should be with us. Verse 15, Vayar Shaul asher hu maskil me'od. Shaul sees that David is successful in everything that he does. Vayagor mipanav, and he dreads from in front of David. He's increasingly scared. This is probably a combination of fear, anger, anxiety, all these different negative emotions are there. Shaul dreads David. Verse 16, as opposed to him, everyone else, V'chol Yisrael v'Yehuda ohevet David. Everybody else in Yisrael and Yehuda, they all love David. Because David marches in front of them, he diligently leads them, and he's good to everybody, right? So again, showing that contrast between Yonatan loves David, the people love David, the servants love David, everyone loves David, except for Shaul. Shaul just increasingly is dreading him more and more and more, and these negative feelings continue to escalate and pile up within Shaul. Let's go to verse 17. We now come to the second half of this chapter. The next episode is David getting involved with Shaul's daughters. Let's not forget for ourselves what was one of the conditions of defeating Goliath. He gets to marry his daughter, right? Interestingly enough, that is not going to come up over here, but David will get himself involved with his daughters. Watch what happens. Verse 17. Vayomer Shaul el David. Shaul says to David, Hine biti hagdola Merav. Behold, here is my oldest daughter. Her name is Merav. Ota eten lecha leisha. I shall give her to you as a wife. However, heyeli leben hayil. May you continue to be a warrior for me. V'hilachem milhamot Adonai, and fight the battles of God. V'Shaul amar. Shaul in his mind is saying to himself, Al tehi yadi bo. Why should my hand be there to kill him? Utihi bo yad Pilishtim. Let the hand of the Pilishtim take care of what I don't want to get my hands dirty with. Okay? Pause just right here. This is a very surprising pasuk. Huh? Right. So he's saying, let them put on the front lines, let them kill him, and let them take care of the dirty work, right? Which ironically is going to be something David will do to somebody else a little bit later on. But we'll come back to that another time. But what is so surprising about this is we would expect Shaul to say to David, David, here's my daughter for you. What should come right after that? Marry her, because why? Because you killed Goliath. I want to repay my debt to you, right? I need to be a man of my word. I promise that whoever kills Goliath can marry my daughter. So here's my daughter because you killed Goliath. That's not mentioned here. He says to him, marry my daughter under the following condition. He places another condition on him. You have to maintain your status as a warrior. What are you talking about? David should turn right around to him and say, I'm going to maintain my status as a warrior for you. You owe me the daughter because I won, right? That's what should go on. So it's almost like that, like they're just driving out the whole Goliath story as if it never happened. And Shaul is offering his daughter to David on the condition that he'll continue to be a warrior for him. Like, it's weird. That's what David's going to answer. We did see that David, when he was talking with people about the reward for the thing, he kept saying to people that reward shouldn't be a factor for you, right? That there were several parts to the reward. It was not only that you're going to marry the king's daughter, but also you're going to have major riches and you're going to be tax-free for the rest of your life and you're going to have major financial gains. David kept getting upset at all the people for saying, like, why are you guys talking about that stuff? That's nonsense. We should be fighting because this guy's cursing Hashem, right? Okay, so maybe because David was he doesn't care. Right. So it could be that from David's perspective, he doesn't care, but it's like Shaul's coming to David and he's erasing it. Like he's not even mentioning it. It's very odd, right? What's David's reaction to this? Verse 18. Vayomed David el Shaul, mi anochi u'mi hayai, who am I? And what is my life worth? Mishpahat avi Israel, what is my family worth? I come from very modest family, modest lineage. I'm not worthy from my family's ancestry to marry that I should become the majesty's son-in-law. Like who am I? Kings choose people from the most prominent of families, from great background. I don't have that. We see David's humility here, obviously coming through. And so David rejects the offer, or at least is humble enough to not want the offer right away. I wanted to come back to one other thing that was just in my mind, and I lost it for a second. Okay, I forgot. Presenting one's daughter, the oldest daughter, to her as from Shaul to David. It reminded me of something. I forgot. I don't know. Anyway, we'll come back to it. I think I'll remember. Anyway, so David takes the first step and he pushes it off, right? He says, no, I'm not worthy of it. Now, if I'm Shaul right here, I should really respond back to him. No, I insist. You won the war. Goliath, you defeated. I have to be a man of my word. Shaul does not do that. Shaul takes the opportunity to slip out of the deal, right? Basically. He says, all right, I did my part. I offered him one time. He didn't want it. Done. But at that time, that Merav, the daughter of Shaul, was offered to David. He immediately gave her to somebody else. She was given to another man, Adriel HaMecholati, as a wife. So almost simultaneous as Shaul is offering Merav to David, he's already marrying her off to another man. It's like almost to suggest that Shaul's offer was not really a genuine offer. And when David rejected it, he's like, beauty, I got out of the deal. I can give my daughter to somebody else. No problem. I'm out with this guy. Put him on the front lines. He's going to fight, and we'll see you later. Problem is, Shaul wasn't prepared for what happens next. Verse 20, Vate'ehav Michal bat Shaul et David. Michal, the other daughter of Shaul, falls in love with David. She's captivated and taken by David. Vayagidu leShaul. They tell this to Shaul. Vayishar hadavar be'inav. And it was pleasant in the eyes of Shaul. So Shaul says, what am I going to do with this? I'm not going to fight this. Maybe I can use this to my advantage. What does he do? Verse 21. Vayomet Shaul. Shaul says, Etenena lo, I will give her to you, to him. Uthi lo lemokesh. She'll be a trap for him. Uthi bo yad Pilishtim. And let the hands of the Pilishtim be to him. By the way, the last time we saw this idea of a woman being a trap to a man who will eventually be conquered by the Pilishtim, ring any bells? Shimshon, very good, right? Almost like we're back in the Shimshon story where someone's trying to trick him into getting a wife that's going to serve as a way for the Pilishtim to kill, right? It's almost like he wants to reinvoke the Shimshon story. Vayomet Shaul el David, bishtayim titchaten bihayom. Right? Shaul says to David a second time, bishtayim titchaten bihayom. Marry me today. In other words, what he means is marry into my family, marry my daughter, and you'll become my son-in-law. Here, what happens? Let's see David's reaction. Well, first is Vaitzav Shaul et Avadav. Shaul says to his servants, Daberu el David balat lemor. Go to David and speak to him privately. Hine chafetz becha hamelech. The king desires you to be his son-in-law. V'chol avadav ahevucha, and all his servants love you. Ve'ata titchaten bamelech. Now, marry into the king's family. Be his son-in-law. Verse 23, V'daberu avdei Shaul be'oznet David et devarim ha'eleh. The servants of Shaul do in fact come and speak to David about this matter. Vayomed David. David's second reaction. The second time he was offered a daughter of the king, he offers a second reaction. This time he doesn't go with the first one. He doesn't talk about how his family is not worthy or anything like that. He says, Hankala be'enechem hitchatem bamelech. Do you think that becoming the son-in-law is a small matter? Ve'anochi ish rash v'nikle. I'm a poor man. Why does David say he's not worthy to marry the king this time? He's poor. He doesn't have money. What do you need to marry the king? You got to have a dowry. You got to have some money to put up, right? You got to have something, right? So David, his first attempt at rejection was the idea that he's not a worthy person as far as his family is concerned. That's when he was being set up with a girl who didn't really like him. It was really just more an arranged marriage to be part of the king's family. So he's saying, my lineage is not worth it. Now he's being set up with a woman who loves him. So the lineage factor is probably not as big a deal anymore because the king is willing to overlook the lineage factor because his daughter's in love with him. Problem is, David says, I don't have anything to offer. I don't have any money to give to you. That's still something that needs to be done. I got to have some support. I got to have some bank to provide for the king and his daughter. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm happy you brought that up. So hold that idea. Yes, the idea that Liz brings up is that the woman is falling in love with the man. And by the way, we don't see what? We do not see David's emotional reaction to this, right? The Pasuk will never tell us David loves Michal back. Hold that idea, okay? Because I want to bring it up as a major point at the end of this chapter. So verse 24, Vayagidu avdei Shaul lo lemor kadevarim ha'ele diber David. So the servants of Shaul bring back this word from David to the king. This is what David said. Vayomer Shaul in verse 25, Ko tomru le David. This is what I want you to tell David. Perfect. David played right into Shaul's hands. En chefetz na melech b'moab. The king doesn't need a dowry. Ki be'me'a orlot pelishtim. All he wants is 100 foreskins from the Pelishtim. In other words, go kill 100 Pelishtim and bring back their foreskins as evidence that you did so. That's what the king wants. To seek vengeance in the enemies of the king. Ironically enough, who's the enemy of the king at this point? David is really the enemy of the king, right? So it's almost like a double entendre. He's telling him, go get to the enemies of the king, but who does Shaul really care about? He really wants David. He's the major enemy of the king. V'Shaul chashav lahapil et David biyad Pelishtim. Shaul's mindset is, let me give David over to the hands of the Pelishtim. By the way, this also seems to invoke a lot of Shimshon, right? Like Shimshon's going and almost looking at the Pelishtim like numbers, 100 Pelishtim, 100 foreskins, right? It's a weird way to phrase it. Like verse 26, very barbaric. Verse 26, Vayagidu avadav leDavid et hadvarim ha'eleh. The servants come back to David. So now David and Shaul are only communicating through messengers, by the way. That's another big deal because Shaul can't bear to see David. Et hadvarim ha'eleh. They speak to each other through the messenger. Vayishar hadavar be'enei David lehitchaten b'melech. This is very pleasant in the eyes of David to become the king's son-in-law. Velo mal'u hayamin. And before time even expired, verse 27, Vayakom David, Vayelechu va'anashav. David gets up together with his men. Vayach ba'Pelishtim 200 ish. He kills amongst the Pelishtim 200 people, double what Shaul had originally asked for him, right? Almost fulfilling what we said in the beginning, right? Hika Shaul ba'alafav, v'David b'rivivotav. Shaul does everything in 1,000. David does everything in 10,000. David always does things in multiples of Shaul because he's double it, as great as he. Right? Vayach Pelishtim 200 ish. He kills 200 people. Vayaved David et orlotehem. David brings their foreskins back to the king. Vaymal'um lamelech. And they are counted out by the king to fulfill the promise. They serve as the dowry to marry into the king's family. Shaul et Michal bito leisha. Shaul gives over Michal, his daughter, as the wife of David. Vayar Shaul, verse 28. Vayar Shaul vayeda ki Adonai im David. Once again, Shaul sees and knows even more deeply. Vayeda now is put in here that God is with David. Umichal bat Shaul ahevatu. And Michal, the daughter of Shaul, loves David. Again, the pasuk reiterates that, I believe, to highlight the fact that it doesn't say David loves Michal back. It just says that he loves. It seems to be, what is David more captivated by? Not so much Michal, but by what else? To be the what? To be the son-in-law of the king. That's really what David is captivated by. Notice how the whole time, I don't know if you paid attention to the language, 4 different times it says, Lehitchaten b'melech. What does Lehitchaten b'melech literally mean? To marry the king. Huh? It's a good question. I don't know if it's so much that he doesn't feel like he could become king without that. But the notion of being in the king's family and then being able to climb up the ranks and being the next king after he was related to the king. In other words, it gives David more credibility. Eventually, when David becomes the king, He wasn't the son of the king, but he was the son-in-law of the king. He's not a stranger becoming the king. He has a rightful place in that position, right? So David seems to be more taken about that the marriage is not so much to Michal as much as it is to the Melech. And even Shaul phrased it that way, Leitchaten bi. You're going to marry into me, right? So David never mentions his love for Michal, and the marriage is almost like an arrangement where David gets to be the son-in-law of the king. That's really what he's captivated by. I want to just read the rest of the Pesukim here, because we're almost done, a couple more. And then I want to bring you what I think is a major parallel here in how to read the end of this chapter.
But do you think it's a personal thing that he's captivated by, or is he kind of watching like Hashem hand that work?
Maybe it's both, right? Is it just personally for his own honor? No, maybe he feels like this is the door that God is opening to me to take my rightful spot, right? Knowing that I'm going to be king, maybe this is what God's opening up to me to make that position more credible for me. Verse 29, Vayesov Shaul, Vayosef Shaul lero mipnei David. Again, the pasuk for maybe the third or fourth time this chapter tells us that he's growing still more afraid. Shaul is growing still more afraid of David. Vahi Shaul oyev et David kol hayamim. That's very serious. Shaul is now an enemy towards David for the rest of his days, right? So we've escalated each story, each happening, each event that took place in this chapter has made Shaul more suspicious of David, more oyen looking at him, more fearful of him, more displeased by him, more distressed by him, to the point where by the end of the chapter, he is his sworn enemy. The chapter ends, Vayetzeu Sareh Pelishtim, that the officers of the Pelishtim go out, as they would continue to go out to fight the Jews. Sachal David mikol avdei Shaul. David was more successful than any of the other officers of Shaul. Vayikar shemo meod, and his reputation soared almost amongst the goyim even, that they started to become afraid of David as well. So everybody is afraid of David, but everybody else, at least if you're on David's side, seems to really love David. The irony of all of this is what? The more Shaul tries to harm David, the more he tries to attack David, what happens? David becomes more and more successful and more beloved to everybody around him. So every time Shaul tries to create a plot to bury David, he just comes out the opposite. And it's like the perfect irony that in the end of the day, Shaul continues to realize that he can't do anything. That when God is with someone, your resistance is futile. It can't do anything, right? And the more you try, the more you accelerate the other person. The opposite totza'ah, the opposite outcome ends up being the case. So this is what this chapter starts. When we started to the end, to just show you the gap, the disparity, and the widening and complexity of their relationship as it continues to progress. And now in the next chapter, Shaul will openly try to kill David, in which David will finally realize it, and then the chase begins. And then the openness of their complicated and adversarial relationship now becomes evident to most people, and that's where we start to take off even more. One thing that I do think it's important to read, I want to go back just for a moment, the last few minutes that we have, to David and Michal. Oftentimes, our methodology has been to read one story in Tanakh through the lens of another story in Tanakh. So the relationship between David and Michal is going to be a complicated one. It will not be an easy one. And it already is, the seeds of this are already starting in the introduction between them and in their marriage. And it's only going to get more and more complicated as the chapters go on. And each time a different event between David and Michal happens, we'll analyze it, we'll revisit this idea. By the end of it, Michal will be being rebuked by David, cursed by David, and she will not be able to bear a child. That's where we end up, right? So it's quite a winding and complicated relationship between David and Michal. The question is, this relationship between David and Michal and some of the other characters, does it remind you of another story that exists in the Tanakh, which is the love between two people, right? And that love sort of almost unfulfilled. We have an adversarial father-in-law with two daughters who one was originally supposed to be given, and then he ends up marrying the other one. Anything? this is very reminiscent. You could read the story of David and Michal through the lens of the story of Yaakov and Rachel, right? So Rav Amnon Bazak brings out 6 different parallels, which I think are just so beautiful towards reading the story and the key difference between the two of them, because oftentimes parallels will highlight the major difference between them. So he writes, the first thing is we have 2 very strong male characters, Yaakov and David, right? Yaakov takes the stone, the rock off of the well to impress Rachel. David defeats Goliath to be able to marry one of his daughters. Eventually, he marries Michal. We have a Was a soul stone? I didn't even put the stone thing. He kills him with a stone. An excellent point. We have a father-in-law who's not so happy with the son-in-law, Lavan and Shaul. And we have 2 daughters who there's a little bit of a strife between them, right? Leah and Rachel, and Merav and Michal. In both instances, the father-in-law tries to marry one of the daughters off to the son-in-law, but it doesn't happen. It's unsuccessful, or it happens, but it wasn't really what was originally agreed upon. And he has to marry the second daughter, right? So Yaakov ends up with both. David only ends up with Michal, but you're seeing the similarities there. The next one is very interesting, right? In both cases, they have to work for the girl double what the original agreement was. So in the case of Rachel, he had to work an additional 7 years, double what the original agreement was for 7 years. And David over here works to kill 200 Pilishtim instead of the 100 that was originally agreed upon, right? That was a fascinating one. That was really eye-opening for me. Huh? Okay. Another.
He kills 200, but
he was only asked to kill 100. Correct. He chooses, but it was double what the original agreement was between them. What about the success? Excellent. Yeah. The more Lavan tries to harm Yaakov, the more successful Yaakov is, and it's an irrational hatred for him because Yaakov is married to your daughters and he's being successful for your daughters. Like the dream of every parent is that their children will marry somebody who's insanely successful, right? That's what everybody wants. And for some reason, the father-in-law is just overcome with these adversarial feelings towards the son-in-law and tries to sabotage the son-in-law. And every time he tries to sabotage him, he ends up becoming more and more successful, right? Bizarre. We also see some language similarities, right? Clearly, ahava, love, plays a big role. We don't typically see a lot of ahava and love and the emotional component, but the Tanakh here mentions it because it's important. It should call into question the love that Yaakov had for Rachel. Now, in that case, it was the love for what the male to the female. Here, it's the female to the male. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Remember, it says the words, go to verse 26 if you want to take a quick peek. At the very end, it says that when David heard what he needed to do to marry Michal, it says, Velo mal'u hayamim. I saw Amy's eyebrows go up when I read those words. I knew she was already in tune with what I was going to say. Velo mal'u hayamim. The time didn't expire and he already jumped to do it. That phrase is also found in the Yaakov and Rachel story. That as Yaakov was working those 7 years for Rachel, it says that he was like Yamim Achadim. It was like it never happened. It was like a snap of a finger. And there too, it says the word that at the end of the 7 years, what does he say to Lavan? Hava et ishti, give me my wife. Ki mal'u yamai. I fulfilled my time. I'm done, right? And so that phrase is also brought in over there. Eventually, the relationship between the father-in-law and the son-in-law in both stories comes to such a difficult head that they chase each other, right? They come to almost destroying each other, blows with each other, and they have to make some kind of a pact to separate themselves from each other at the fear of one killing the other. Lavan and Yaakov have this problem. Yaakov has to run away in the middle of the night with his 2 daughters. Lavan chases him down. He tells him, I could do a lot of harm to you, but I'm not going to because Hashem stopped me. We're going to make a pact and we're going to separate from each other. The same will eventually happen between David and Shaul. David has to run away from Shaul. Shaul's chasing him the whole time. They want to kill each other. Shaul wants to kill him, I should say. And eventually they have to make a pact to separate from each other. So all of this is a tremendous, the parallels are eye-opening that this is basically the same story with that one major difference. That one major difference is David's love for Michal is reversed. It's not there, right? We don't see David's love for Michal the same way we find Yaakov's love for Rachel. And that's going to complicate the relationship between them. Whereas Yaakov always retains his love for Rachel and the favoritism that he shows to her children, and despite it was unfulfilled, they didn't have the easiest of relationships. There was a mutual love that they had for each other, and that Yaakov especially has for Rachel. Here it's the reverse. We see Michal have this love for David, but David doesn't send that love back. There's not that reciprocity from David's perspective, which is going to complicate their relationship as we continue far down. And that's why we end up having David rebuking Michal and criticizing Michal by the end of the story. One last point on this parallel, and then I'll take the questions, is you also find the parallel between Shaul and Lavan. And that's a tough one, right? Not to say that Shaul is Lavan, right? God forbid, because Shaul is a different person, but Shaul is behaving Lavan-like in this parallel. Shaul is playing the part of Lavan in this story. The enraged father-in-law who's acting irrationally towards his son-in-law, his successful son-in-law, and wants to harm him, right? And wants to sabotage him. That's the role that Shaul is playing, and that's very eye-opening for us as to where Shaul's character has unfortunately deteriorated. Well, at this point, we don't know that David doesn't have any knowledge of Shaul's hatred for him. I mean, you could say maybe he sensed something was afoot, maybe, right? Yeah, there were hints, there were signs. Yeah, but would that be reason to marry their daughter? Like, wouldn't you want to separate yourself more from that person if that was the case? I definitely think there are hints there, and David may have felt something, but I think from the simple way the story progresses, it won't be until next chapter that David's eyes are open to what Shaul wants to do to him. And at this stage of the game, I don't know that his marriage to her is so that he can try to find favor in Shaul's eyes because he thinks Shaul hates him. He may just want to find favor in Shaul's eyes and get closer to the king because he thinks that's a good move. It's a good move, especially in the fact that he knows he's going to become the king, right? So a lot of different things playing a role over here. The word ahav, by the way, in this chapter is a milat mancha, is a recurring word. The word occurs 6 times in this chapter, the word ahav. And so ahav, in contrast to fear, love versus fear is really the major theme of this chapter as it is. How everyone else loves David and Shaul fears David. And the gap that's created between all of those people and David on one side and Shaul on the other side is really what this chapter is all about. And that gap is only going to continue to grow and become the source of all of the trials and tribulations that we're going to read about in the chapters to come. Any questions, thoughts? Okay, so a lot there. We'll pick up Be'ezrat Hashem in chapter 19 next week. Enjoy.